Can you guys hear me?
Okay, Dr. Myers, can you hear me? Were you able to hear me, Dr. Myers? We were able to hear you coming in the room, so if you could try talking on the microphone again and seeing if that works. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, we had some issues with this Blackboard group. It looks like they've gotten their servers back up just in time, but we've been trying since about 12:15. Okay, everyone, this is our first spring virtual seminar series here for the CDRE here at Millersville University. We're really excited to have Dr. Laura Myers with us from the University of Alabama, Center for Advanced Public Safety. Dr. Myers holds a doctorate in criminology from Florida State, and her research, publication, and training areas include disaster management and planning, weather enterprise, application research, criminal justice education, criminal courts and criminal justice ethics, criminal justice administration, and cultural diversity. Dr. Myers has been part of the integrated warning team systems throughout a good chunk of our country, especially the Southeast, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the importance of that. So without further ado, this is Dr. Laura Myers.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to get to talk to you about the integrated warning team process. I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are and how they're used, and we're going to talk about it primarily in the context of warning dissemination, because the goal of the integrated warning team is to enhance the warning dissemination process. So we'll talk for about 40 minutes about this, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. And as I go through this, if you've been involved in an integrated warning team, you probably have several examples and comments about how the integrated warning teams work. So be thinking of those, because those will be some great contributions when we get to the discussion at the end. Okay, so let's first of all talk about what an IWT is. The integrated warning team concept has been around for a little while, and it originated with the National Weather Service. It's a National Weather Service approach to bringing some of the key partners together to work on the warning dissemination process. Even though it's been initiated by the National Weather Service, it's been done in many different ways across the country, in many different regions of the country. And it's not necessarily something that's been led by the National Weather Service. In some cases, it's been led by emergency management, sometimes by the broadcast meteorologists in a particular region. And they're not always called an integrated warning team. They may go by different names. There's also some other types of approaches to the same concept that are not even integrated warning teams, but they're things like local emergency planning committees and regional emergency planning committees, and I'll refer to some of those as we talk about integrated warning teams this afternoon. So I want to give you some examples of some of the more common integrated warning teams and some of the ones that I've worked with in the recent past to give you an idea of what they do, how they do it, and some of the things that they've accomplished with the approach. One of the first IWTs I worked with is the Peachtree City, Georgia IWT. That's the Atlanta region. And they've been working with their IWT for many years now in regards to focusing on the warning dissemination process as a result of previous events in their region that they wanted to address and improve the warning dissemination process. The IWT in Birmingham, Alabama, and Huntsville, Alabama, as well as the Wi-Fi group, which is a different name, in Jackson, Mississippi, all originated about the same time as a result of the April 27th, 2011 tornadoes. And so all four of these IWTs are in the Southeast region and have worked together and separately on their IWTs as a result of previous events and trying to work on improving gaps in the warning dissemination process. Now, these particular IWTs have produced several different products, and I want to give you some examples of some of those products just to give you an idea of what IWTs can do. One of the things that IWTs work on, and these in particular have worked on, are impact-based messaging concepts in terms of can we improve the warning dissemination process by converting to impact-based messaging. And so a lot of the work of these IWTs was exploring whether or not impact-based messaging would work, and if it does, then how do we develop the correct impact-based messaging. They worked on warning dissemination improvement in terms of which partners need to be more involved in the process, who's missing information, who needs more lead time, and so working on the development of all that, as well as the partnership development process. As I mentioned earlier, the IWTs are typically composed of what we call the core partners, which are the media, emergency management, and the weather service. But a part of the IWT is growing the partnership and adding more partners to the process. So a lot of the IWTs I've worked with have really grown over time in terms of adding partners. And with each subsequent event that these IWTs work through, they realize where the gaps are in the partnership process and which other groups need to be added. And we're going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon in terms of why it's important to grow the partnerships in the IWT. Another thing they've worked on is vulnerable population assessments in terms of trying to figure out who's getting the warnings and who's not getting the warnings, or if they get the warnings, why they're not able to respond appropriately. And that's been a big part of what the IWTs have worked on, is trying to make sure that the warning dissemination process is reaching the population correctly, getting to them with enough time, and making sure they're able to respond appropriately. Now, just giving you that context of what some of these IWTs have done and some of the things they've worked on, I want to really kind of give you the structure of how an IWT works and what the whole process is. First of all, when IWTs form, and when I say when they form, when they officially decide to unite for a common purpose, it comes down to what kind of goals they set for themselves. And each IWT is different. Each IWT develops for different reasons. They all have different goals. There may be some commonalities, but they're really unique and particular to their region and their particular needs. So I want to give you some ideas of some of the goals that I've seen with some of these IWTs, and as you listen to this, I want you to think about it in regards to what kind of goals you've seen if you have an IWT in your region, or if you're planning to develop an IWT, would these be potential goals that your group may want to work on? As I mentioned previously, one of the main goals is working on event gaps. After severe weather events, a lot of times the IWT partners come together to look at what may have gone wrong. And the first question is to evaluate, did anything go wrong? And so they want to look at particular issues. And these IWTs can meet annually, or they can meet more often. And so when they focus on these event gaps, it may be that they need to do this quarterly and actually look at particular things that have been happening over the last quarter. Or it may be seasonally that they look at some of these severe weather events and potential gaps that have occurred, and that they want to make sure that they're working toward reducing those gaps. So we'll talk about some examples of some of those types of events and some of the things that have been worked on, but that is a primary goal of some of the IWTs. Another goal is maintenance of the warning dissemination process. Assessing how the warning dissemination process is working in particular events, and maintaining the best practices, the things that are working right. And so the IWT becomes a mechanism for making sure that we're constantly communicating between the partners and making sure that we're aware of how the process is working and maintaining things that are working right. Another goal of the IWTs has been educational outreach, trying to determine if there needs to be more and different or better educational outreach to the public, to partners, to various parts of the community that may need more information about the warning dissemination process. And as I talk this afternoon, I'll give you some examples of what some of that educational outreach has been and how it's been done. As I mentioned previously, another big IWT goal is partnership development. I mentioned the big three, the core partners, and so a lot of times when we first start an IWT, it's a matter of getting those three groups together. There may have been efforts to work on one-to-one partnerships, like the weather service with the media or the weather service with emergency management. But to bring the three together may be the next step. And so a lot of times it's just getting the three together in a way that works for all three partner groups. And then in addition to that, adding the additional partners outside the core and identifying who those partners need to be and getting them to the table and getting them involved in this process. Another IWT goal has been to respond better to uncertain and unique events, and I'm going to give you some examples of that as we discuss this afternoon, because a lot of times, you know, when we're talking about very common and traditional severe weather events, our communities and our warning dissemination process work very well. But then when we have some uncertain weather events or very unique events, they actually create a situation that we may not have seen before, and we want to learn from that and figure out with the IWT what we can do to deal with uncertainty better and how we can respond better to these unique events if they should occur again. And I'll give you some examples of those as well. And then finally, a major IWT goal is just to respond to ongoing and new issues. The IWT, once it gets established, is a matter of an ongoing process. And so different regions have done this differently in terms of how they respond to ongoing and new issues that evolve over time. And so, for example, in some regions, a particular severe weather season may be very unusual, and they decide that they want to respond to that. Or they decide that prior to an upcoming weather season, they want to do more preparedness work and more outreach. And so the ongoing and new issues is really a connector from one IWT meeting to another and really kind of guides the process in terms of what they do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the weather enterprise in regards to the IWT. I mentioned the core partners, the emergency managers, the broadcast meteorologists, and the weather forecasters. And so, you know, those are the ones that we normally think of when we talk about the warning dissemination process. But then in addition to that, we really need to think about the whole partnership process in regards to the weather enterprise. Who all is involved in that warning dissemination process. And that's different. The weather enterprise is different in every region and every community in regards to who all the emergency planners are, who all the additional partners are that need to be at the table. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about people who have to make decisions about weather. And when we really focus in our communities on who those major decision makers are, that helps us identify who those partners need to be and how we need to figure out how to get them to the table in this partnership process. Another component of the weather enterprise and the IWT process is the inclusion of social scientists. Over the last couple of years, the IWTs as well as the National Weather Service have been bringing in social scientists to help with an understanding of the public response to the weather warning process. So the IWTs and the weather enterprise have been trying to locate social scientists in their region or around the country that are willing to work with them to provide that information and assist that process. And that's what I do, and that's one of the reasons I'm here talking to you today, is because of the work I've done with several of the IWTs. And what we do is we assist the IWT process as the IWT partners come together and work on particular issues when they need information on how their publics may be responding and what their publics do in severe weather events. We can actually conduct surveys and interviews and get that information for them. We can also provide information in terms of what's been learned in terms of better communication processes and responding to these gaps. So that's another component of the IWT. This is a picture from the Peachtree City IWT. This was their first IWT. And the reason that I am providing this for you is to show you a little bit about how these things work and how we come together in different venues and work through this. This is what I would call a regional integrated warning team. And the people in this picture represent several different county warning areas, different WFOs for the National Weather Service. This is Birmingham, Huntsville, Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi. There's several emergency managers in this group from all over the state of Georgia as well as the surrounding states. There's several broadcast media in this group. And this being the first one, you can see about the size of this group. And over time, this group has grown from this number, which was about 40 people, I think, at its maximum, up to the last IWT we had just in December that had over 200 people. So as the process grows, we add more partners, we get more people to the table, and they also change in their scope and what they do. Now let's talk about the logistics of the integrated warning team. First of all, when you're thinking about how to do an IWT, I have a lot of National Weather Service offices and planning groups contact me about, well, how does everybody else do it? And I can tell you a lot about how different IWT groups do it, but I also tell you it's important to really put it in the context of what works best in your location, in your region. So I'm going to give you several different examples, and I'm going to address some of these issues in terms of logistically how you set them up. So first of all, people always ask me, well, where should we hold an integrated warning team? And I've seen them done in different places. I've seen them done in big, large conference centers. I've seen them done in workshop space. I've seen them done in very small conference rooms. It really depends on where you're starting and how many partners you're going to bring to the table at first. And it also depends on how you're going to interact in the process. And it's really important when you think about an IWT to really think about the communication process. You're bringing these partners together. They're going to communicate and discuss with each other. And it's really not about pouring information to these partners. It's about getting them to communicate with each other on the various goals and the things that they're working on. So the location that you choose to do one of these really needs to be conducive to that communication process. And it also has to be a place that people can get to. When we're talking about your broadcast mets, your emergency managers, and your weather service folks, it's a matter of what's a good convenient location to them. Sometimes it also needs to be a neutral location. A lot of the IWTs are held in a neutral location, so it doesn't look like emergency management is leading it, or the broadcast mets are leading it, or the weather service is leading it. So it depends really kind of on your community and your context in regards to what the best location is. Now the next issue is how often should an IWT meet? In the beginning, most IWTs try to meet annually. They try to meet once a year. I've seen some IWTs meet quarterly, like I mentioned, because they like to take each quarter and look at what's been going on and address those. But then those IWT groups tend to be smaller when they do the more quarterly meetings. When we spread them out and do them every 6 months or annually, then those are much bigger venues, a longer type of a workshop with a lot of different partners involved. And so you have to decide how often you think works best for what you're trying to do. In the beginning, it may be just about bringing the partners together, trying to figure out what the goals are, and getting things kicked off. And then later on, you kind of change that focus as you add more partners, and then you may decide you want to do it seasonally. So it really depends on how it evolves. The duration of the IWT. IWTs have varied in different time frames. I've seen some try to do it like for a 2-day period with an overnight. The Peachtree City one did that on their first one, and in a few minutes I'll talk a little bit about how that didn't work very well, because that means people have to stay overnight. It becomes a long duration event. It becomes more like a conference, and that can be difficult to actually maintain. What we recommend is a 1-day event, and usually less than a full day, because one of the issues is with a workshop of this nature, trying to bring everybody together and get them in one place and get them to stay together for a long period of time can be difficult. Your broadcast meteorologists have to go to work. So you got your broadcast mets coming off their morning show, and then they have to get to their afternoon and evening shows. And so we usually try to hold these things between 9 o'clock in the morning and 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and hold a lunch in there, a working lunch, so that we get all of our partners together at the same time. If you try to go longer, you're going to start to lose some of the partners in that process. The next issue is, what is the format and what is the agenda for the process? The agenda comes from your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. And then the format is, how are you going to actually conduct that agenda? And what we have found is that it's much better to have discussions and collaboration on particular issues, facilitated discussion, than it is to have presentations and information being pushed out to people. one of the better formats is really kind of a mixture of that. A little bit of presentation on particular issues that generates the discussion, and then the discussion and the collaboration really becomes the action of the whole process. Now, I want to give you some background on all the things that I just discussed and give you some examples. And I'm going to give you examples primarily from the Atlanta Weather Service, who's conducted several of these, but I'm also going to give you some examples from several others. And like I said, if you've been involved in an IWT, you've got some examples of all this as well. So feel free to share that with us when we get down to the Q&A. So first of all, one of the things that has evolved with IWTs are the lessons learned about what really works best for a particular region and their particular IWT. So Atlanta has done multiple IWTs. This is kind of an overview of what came of their first, second, and third IWTs over several seasons. And essentially what they've done is to identify their purposes and their potential goals in regards to seasons and types of events. So some of theirs have focused on winter weather, severe weather, flooding, as well as tropical events. Atlanta, as you may be aware, has had some issues with winter weather. They had a major event last year, not in terms of the amount of precipitation, but the impact back in January of last year that shut the city down. And so they've done a lot of work on their winter weather warning dissemination process. And they also did a lot with severe weather because of the tornadoes in the region over the last few years. And flooding has become one that's been really, really topical because there's not been a lot of attention paid to the warning dissemination process and flooding, and there's a lot of new work being done. And then, of course, there's always the tropical, the hurricane stuff. And so that's some of the work that Atlanta has focused on. Now, another aspect has been to identify the audience. And this is something I want all of you to think about if you're considering developing an IWT or growing your IWT, is who is your audience? Who do you want in that process in the beginning, and who do you want to include over time? And so what Atlanta has done is look at their audience in regards to each type of event that they're looking at. So if they're focusing on winter weather, then which partners need to be at the table. And of course, it always needs to be the core partners, but then it also has to be additional partners that might be relevant to the particular goals or topics that they're looking at that particular IWT. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the horizontal as well as the vertical structure of the audience in terms of, who do you bring in locally, which is kind of the horizontal structure, as well as vertically. When you go from the local level to the state level to the federal level, you need to have those partners involved in the process as well. Now, one of the things that Peachtree City learned is the difficulty of doing these things. And that's one of the reasons I want to share this with you, because the goal is to eliminate the difficulties. Like I said, with Atlanta, they did a 2-day workshop the first time, and it was way too much. They used too much PowerPoint, and people were like, okay, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of this. And one of the big things is to plan way ahead. To make sure that you have the right dates, that you have the right agenda, that you have the right location, so that it takes a lot of planning in this process. Logistics can be very difficult. Securing the location is probably the first thing that you need to do. I'm working with a couple of new IWTs right now, and with each of those IWTs, the location is the key. And we really can't make much forward progress on the plan until we get that location set. And so make sure that you get that done, and make sure that you have a situation where you've got backup to that location. Because as you know, with what we do, with the work that you guys do, you can set this, you can secure a date, and then the severe weather comes and you're not able to hold it on that particular date, and you're going to have to move it. So make sure your location is amenable to letting you move that date. There's also funding rules and regulations. The Peachtree City National Weather Service office is under a bunch of rules in terms of how they can pay for particular aspects of this. And so a lot of times it's contributions. People sponsor things that are associated with this. We try to get a free location, always get a free location if you can. But then there's going to be things like lunch and coffee and danishes and that sort of thing, or the pads and pencils and pens that you need. So any of the logistical stuff that you need, you got to figure out in advance how you're going to do that. And one of the recommendations we make to IWTs is get it all donated, get it all sponsored. And in addition to that, the person or people who plan this can be anyone. In the Weather Service, it doesn't have to be the warning coordinator or meteorologist. It can be anybody at the Weather Service. It could be emergency management. It could be a broadcast net. It just depends on what works best. It could be a planning group from all of those core partners. So it doesn't have to be one person in particular. It should be a committee, and it can represent all the different partner groups if needed. Now, a big part of the IWTs that work very well are the focus groups and the breakout sessions, and that's where all the discussion takes place. So when you set up an IWT and you're really focusing on your goals, you're going to want to put them in these focus groups and then in these breakout sessions, and you're not going to be able to accomplish too many of those within a one-day workshop. So that's where a lot of your planning takes place, is how do you logistically plan for what you want to accomplish, allow for the discussion and collaboration, and accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. So that's some of the perspective that we can bring to this in terms of what we can provide to you about what works, what doesn't, what works best, and what may work best for what you're trying to do with the development of your own IWT. So here's some other tips for developing your IWT workshops. Like I said, you want to plan early, and it's a really good idea to ask for help from previous IWT workshops. Talk to some of the other regions and some of the other IWT folks that have done this. Or talk to people like me. Like I said, I get calls from different IWT groups all the time asking if I can give them some perspective on how to do this, and I'm really glad to do that. So if any of you need that kind of assistance, that's what you need to do. Just ask, because we're so willing to provide any perspective we can to help you develop what you want to do with your IWT. Another tip is to make sure you involve your partners in the planning process. One thing you don't want to do is plan this all by yourself and not have your partners involved, because you want your partners to have ownership in the process. So let them know what you're trying to do. Let them know you want to get them involved. So for example, I'm working with an IWT that's being formed down in Louisiana for the Slidell National Weather Service. And what we're doing down there is meeting a series of planning meetings way in advance of the first IWT to get all the partners in and to get their perspectives on how this should work and what goals we want to try to achieve and how we want to set up the process. And a big piece of that is to make those partners feel comfortable with the process and feel like they have ownership. So it's really critical to do that. And like I said, in terms of the way you conduct this, you want to avoid too much PowerPoint. You want to try things like panel discussions and focus groups and breakout sessions. And we found that the panel discussions seem to work really, really well, even better than the breakout sessions and the focus groups, because it's everybody in the room. You have a panel of people up in front, and these panels typically represent the partners that are involved and the goals that you're trying to achieve, or they represent different partners and the issues. One of the best formats I've seen is like an emergency management panel, a broadcast meteorologist panel, a weather service panel, and then other types of panels based on the different groups. And they get up on their panel and they talk about various issues, and then they open it up to discussion with the rest of the group. And it's fascinating to see the discussions that occur, the questions that get asked, the understandings that are accomplished, because one of the big things is to try to get the different partner groups to understand each other better and figure out where some of the gaps may be in miscommunication and lack of knowledge about what the other partners are doing in the warning dissemination process. Now, another big aspect of this is making sure there's plenty of mingling time so that people can discuss kind of outside the formal processes. So like in the morning when people register and come in and they're having the coffee and danishes, let them mingle with each other, let them talk to each other. And then you want to have a couple of breaks, 15-minute breaks of course, and places where they can mingle during that process and talk. So that's really, really helpful in developing connections and contacts. And I've been amazed at how well that's worked for the IWTs, because a lot of times people kind of know of each other, or they've seen each other or talked to each other in, actual events, but they've never had time to talk to each other offline and be able to, really get, a really good relationship established. Another thing is to develop a communication method for after the IWT workshops, and different IWTs have done this in different ways. One is just follow-up communication from the planning group, letting people know what was accomplished and what the goals are for the next IWT and any activities that are going to take place in between. I've seen Facebook pages created for the communication method so that there can be a communication process ongoing. I've seen listserv discussions done amongst all of the people in the workshop so that they can continue to communicate. I've seen subcommittees of the IWTs have their own communication processes. It really just depends on what you think's best for the development of your IWT and how you think that process ought to work. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Now, one of the biggest challenges for the IWT workshops and doing this is time and funding. Trying to build this into the time frames that you have. I mean, you've got your severe weather seasons, you've got, all the other activities that are going on. One of the things that you have to avoid for the broadcast meteorologists are their sweeps months, so that you're not interfering when they can't get away from their work. So you've got to figure out, when are the best times to do this, how often can you do this and not run into time constraints. So, and that'll depend on your region and what works best for your group. The funding is another big challenge, and like I said, we've come up with all kinds of creative ways to deal with the funding. Remember, if you do a one-day workshop, you've really reduced your funding. If you get free locations, then that helps tremendously. And I mentioned the whole idea of donations and sponsorships. And you'd be amazed at how many people are willing to donate and sponsor. And I do a lot of that for the IWTs. I always contribute something to each IWT I work with because I think it's really important to help sponsor that process. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of the IWT, and this comes from several of the IWTs I've worked with, things that we've seen that have been accomplished. From the Weather Service perspective, the benefits that they've noted are building relationships with new partners that they'd not previously worked with, such as in Atlanta, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That's a huge disaster management partner in the Georgia area. They work a lot with disasters. They have a lot to contribute in the process. So within your region, there may be partners that would be particularly beneficial and useful to the process. And so it's a matter of identifying who those partners are, who they need to be, and getting them to the table. And I can talk a little bit as we discuss this about how you figure out who those partners are, because a lot of times we're not aware of who they are. And sometimes it emerges after a severe weather event who some of those partners are that have felt like they weren't part of the warning communication process. And so after we do an assessment after an event, we can start to identify who we need to add to the partnership process. The emergency managers talk about various benefits, and a big issue for emergency managers has been to gain a better understanding of the discipline and functions of the other team members. It's amazing to me the perceptions that emergency managers and broadcast METs and the Weather Service have about each other. You work together, but you really don't understand where these different groups are coming from until you can get in the same room and talk about these issues. And it's really been cool to see people learning about each other and figuring out why the different groups do what they do in disaster events, and really kind of getting a better understanding of why they do what they do. From the media's perspective, it's an opportunity to work closely with the Weather Service on product changes, because that's a big deal, because the broadcast METs are using those products, and so this is a great opportunity to sit down and talk about what the current products are, what product changes are. I mentioned the impact-based warning work that's been done with some of the IWTs, so it's really important to get that out in front of the broadcast METs, get their input to it, let them know what the Weather Service is doing, and of course emergency managers benefit from that as well. And then I mentioned, of course, having the social scientists involved. And what that does is it kind of creates an openness across the group for doing work differently by bringing in data, by bringing in information that might be useful to the group. And one of the fears of the IWTs is if you're bringing in social scientists, they're afraid you're going to get these researcher types who are going to come in there and try to tell everybody how to do what they do. And that's not the kind of social scientists we're talking about. These are people that are there to assist the process. They're the ones that are there to say, okay, what do you need from us? What information can we bring to you? What can we do for you that will get you the information that you need? And then, like I said, we also know all the research that's been done, and so when you ask particular questions, we have those answers because we know that research. So that's a big benefit to the process. Now, I mentioned the issue of funding and trying to actually work through the logistics of all of this. Lunch is always a big issue. If you send people out for lunch, they're likely not to come back. And you need that lunch hour to actually conduct business, to actually get a lot of work done. So we always do the lunch on site. And one of the easiest things that we've done is either get it sponsored, which depending on the size of your group can be more or less expensive, or we've just had people bring $10 and we provide the box lunch and they pay the $10. And it really depends on what you think your partnership group can bear in terms of that process. So you got to kind of look at that and figure out what will work. You're going to need an RSVP, and so like Atlanta uses an Eventbrite site to register and get their RSVPs. Others do it manually through email or telephone calls and get that information. But we have lots of ideas on how to do that to make it more efficient for you. And there's a lot of technology that makes it much more efficient that are really easy to use. And I mentioned utilizing your nonprofits and your partners in terms of, some of the funding issues. Like if you bring in a speaker from outside the area and you need to cover their travel, it might be that your local NWA AMS chapter would pay for the travel because they can bring that speaker in and they can pay to have that person speak at their event as well. Like I mentioned, collecting the lunch money ahead or having people sponsor and bring in the things that you need. In Atlanta, Georgia Tech and myself provided folders, papers, and pads, and that's real cheap stuff for sponsors to actually contribute to the process, and it makes it a very professional undertaking when you have that kind of content there. Now, what are the outcomes of these IWTs? First of all, you got to be realistic with the outcomes. You're not going to accomplish a lot in a first IWT. What you'll accomplish is getting everybody together in the same place. And you may focus on some goals, you may get some ideas, but it's really a matter of your outcomes are going to be the result of doing this over time. And I've seen with every IWT significant things accomplished over time. And it's just a matter of making sure the IWTs continue, making sure everybody still comes together. And it's not a hard thing to do because everybody's interested in this process. You also have to realize that people are not being paid to do it or they may not be allowed to participate. So you've got to make it as easy as possible to make these things happen. And so make them as local as possible, make them as low impact as possible, make them as cheap as possible. Anything that you can do to make sure you get as many people there as possible. Another thing to do is being able to disseminate the information from the workshops, like setting up a hashtag and having people tweet and communicate. Some IWTs have, decided they don't want to send information out about what's going on. Others do. And it really depends on, how you want to set up that process. And then finally, with what you're trying to accomplish, you want to be flexible with deadlines and implementations. Because if you start with a particular IWT meeting and say, okay, this is what we want to accomplish by our next meeting, that's going to be hard to do because people have to go back to work. People have so many other things on their plate. So you have to be flexible. And so you're kind of in an ongoing process, constantly working toward your goals and your implementations. And so if you try to set, hard and fast deadlines, that's going to be frustrating, and that'll frustrate the planners as well as the participants. So it really has to be an ongoing process. You'll notice over here I've got an agenda from the Atlanta IWT, kind of gives you an idea of the timing of the event. Remember I talked about kind of starting at 9 and ending at around 2 or 3 o'clock. And that seems to be a really good time frame. You can see the lunch hour in here. You can see the breaks in here. You can kind of see who the topics are for this particular event. This one was a winter weather workshop that was held in December of 2013, which is really interesting because they had decided to focus on winter weather for that particular IWT. And then they had this really crazy winter weather event in January that led to their little snowmageddon that shut down Atlanta. And so their subsequent IWTs have been focusing on the same issue because of all of the gaps that occurred in that particular event. So that's just a good example for you to see what an agenda might look like. Now, one of the things that IWTs do sometimes is set up action teams. If they're focusing on particular things, then they'll set up action teams to focus on the different goals. So here's an example of some action teams that can be developed, and these names that are associated with them are something that this particular IWT did to just give the group a name. So they had a team that was focused on communication, one that was focused on regulations and guidelines, another that was focused on preparedness, another on products and services and remodeling products and services and reinventing products and services. And these were some overriding teams that were part of starting with the first IWT and working on these particular things offline in between IWTs and then bringing back what they had done to the next IWT. Now, this involves a lot of activity, and some of these groups are stronger than others. And so if you go with this kind of a format, it really depends on what you think you can accomplish. And it may be you need fewer teams, or maybe the team approach doesn't work as well for your IWT. But it's one way of actually trying to accomplish some of these goals. Another thing to do is to make sure that you've developed action items for your IWT. So if you're going to have them go away and work on something, make sure you've developed those action items. And so the IWT workshop can be all about determining what those action items are. And here's some examples of some: standardizing siren policy or guidance, studying ways to improve the effectiveness of severe weather awareness campaigns, develop a new warning engine to make the message personal and specific to the audience. So you can do a lot of different things depending on what you think your group needs to work on, and that's what they're going to do, is they're going to figure this out and figure out these are the things that they want to accomplish. Another thing that the IWTs do is focus on particular issues that they think are important. And so I mentioned the December 2013 winter weather IWT that focused on various winter issues. One was the wind chill advisory warning criteria. And I provide these to you to see these are the specific questions that they wanted to address. Based on research, does the current wind chill advisory warning criteria need to be changed? If so, what should the criteria be? So the IWT workshop focused on addressing that question from all of the partner perspectives. They worked on the winter storm warning criteria. Does the current criteria for winter storm warnings meet the partner's needs? If not, what should the updated criteria be? Consistent messaging. Provide a standardized set of messages in regards to health and safety for winter weather that can be used by all partners. And then I mentioned impact-based warnings. Define the criteria for what the impact-based warnings ought to be. And that's something that the whole partnership group can answer and work on, and you're really customizing it to the needs of all of your partners. Now, those are just some examples. And so now I want to kind of talk about this in generalities and kind of talk about the importance of the partners in this process. Like I said, IWTs are about focusing on gaps and issues that a particular region wants to focus on. One of the gaps is the perceptions of the public. We're always being asked by IWTs, well, why does the public not act on the weather warning process correctly? Why don't they do what they're supposed to do? Why are we ending up with fatalities? Why are we ending up with people who say they didn't get the warnings? So trying to get a better understanding of your particular public can be important in this process. And we can tell you from the social science perspective about your own community as well as people in general, because everything that we've learned is that even in a particular community, it's going to be the same way in different communities. You're going to find a lot of commonalities. You're going to find that people don't get the warnings for about the same reasons. You're going to find that people disregard the warnings for similar reasons. You're going to find out that the similar demographics are associated with being more weather savvy or less weather savvy. And that really gets us to the other issue of, for a particular region, what is the health of the Weather Enterprise Network? How well does the partnership work together? Are there any gaps in that process? And trying to figure out who's missing at the table. Another gap that we focus on are communication gaps. The number one issue in warning dissemination is communication. Are we communicating properly? Are we getting the message out there? How well is our outreach education? Are we educating everybody? Are we making them as prepared as possible? Have we not been educating as much as we could? Have we gotten lax in that process? And then finally, are there any gaps in preparedness? And in some locations, people are very well prepared because they get a lot of severe weather. It happens to them often. The Weather Enterprise works really hard to make sure everybody is prepared. And in other places, weather is more random, it's more transient, and so those folks are not as prepared because they're not as familiar with it or used to it. So we talk about how to deal with those particular gaps. Other gaps include the issue of vulnerable populations, and I mentioned that. Another issue is language barriers and how do we reach different populations who don't necessarily speak English. We have to look at gaps because some groups are impacted more than others, so in different types of events, different groups will be impacted more than others. We have to realize that severe weather events can exacerbate mental health issues, and so how do we conduct the warning dissemination process, understanding that different people are going to react in different ways, and also that different cultures are going to react in different ways. When we tell different people that they have to evacuate because of cultural reasons, they're going to perceive that information in different ways. For some cultures, the male head of household has to decide what's going to happen and what they're going to do, and if the male head of household is not at home, then the rest of the family will wait until the male head of household gets home to tell them what they're supposed to do. So we need to understand those particular issues so that we understand why people do what they do. We also want to enhance strengths in the process. What's working well? Are people using NOAA weather radios? What kind of mobile alerts are they using? Do they have shelters? Do they have emergency plans? So we really want to enhance that process with the IWT. We also want to look at not just how well our IWTs are working, but our local emergency planning committees, our regional emergency planning teams. And this can all be part of the IWT, is bringing all these groups together and kind of coordinating these. The regional emergency planning teams work with storm-ready groups, developing partnerships, and actually working together to plan and exercise for severe weather events. Here's some examples of some of the other collaborative partners you want to bring together in the process: schools, businesses, hospitals, medical, entertainment venues, local government, faith-based organizations, volunteer organizations. Depending on your community, there's a whole potentiality of collaborative partners that you may want to add to this process. Now, let me talk real quickly about the importance of the partner process. The partners need to be part of the regional emergency planning process, and there are certain elements for a partner to be engaged in that planning process. They've got to have the information to make the best decisions for whoever they need to get this information to. They need to be connected to the Weather Enterprise Network. They need situational awareness. They need to be prepared. And they have to be able to make critical decisions when they get the warning information. And this means being involved in multi-jurisdictional partnerships. Now, this is why this is critical, and this is how you decide what partners you need to add to this process. Because you've got decision makers out there like school administrators and business owners who are going to have to make a decision about severe weather events such as, do we close, do we evacuate, do we cancel, when do we reopen? And we know that with weather information, they're going to make the best decision possible, but if they don't have enough good information, they make the right decision or the wrong decision, a type 1 or a type 2. And to make the best decision, they've got to be connected to the network, they've got to get the right information, the needed information, and even with the best information, they may not make the choice we think they should. So for example, schools trying to make the decision should they close or stay open, are going to go through a cost-benefit analysis. Recreational venues like hotels and resorts are going to do the same thing. And they're going to sit there and go, well, should I take the risk? Or, what's the cost going to be to us if we close? So even with the best of information, they may make a decision that's based on those costs and benefits. So that means we've got to make sure that they're part of the network, that they're part of the IWT, and they know how to get the best information possible for situational awareness. Now I'm going to give you a couple of examples to show you about how this process breaks down. This is the Indiana State Fair a couple of years ago. Now, these should be partners in the process. If you're holding mass venue events like this, you need to get weather information. You need to get that information quickly and make decisions about large groups of people. The Indiana State Fair did a cost-benefit analysis, and they were trying to stay in place as long as they possibly could. They were hoping this thing wouldn't get to them as quickly as it did, and they were hoping it would go around them. But this was the gust front on the front of that storm, and that's what brought down that set. This is the January 28th snow event that we had in Birmingham and Atlanta last year. This is an uncertain event, and a lot of poor decisions were made that day. Schools decided to stay open, businesses decided to stay open, and because they basically did not adjust well to an evolving and an uncertain event. So how do we provide better information to the partners in that process so that we don't have calamities like what we had in Birmingham and Atlanta last year? So really what it comes down to are the outcomes of an IWT. How do we provide the information to the partners? How do we get them to the table? How do we get them to understand the process better? And it's really about addressing our partner needs. We've got to find out what their needs are. We've got to enhance partner communication. And what this does is it improves a lot of community level benefits. It's about message consistency, making sure that as we disseminate the warnings, these partners understand how they're going to get it, how it's going to evolve, and that provides more consistency in the message so that people understand what to do. We're also trying to close the gaps in the warning decision process, and we're also trying to add as many new partners to that process as we can. We also want to regionalize. We don't want to keep it small. We want to get to as many partners in the region as possible because they're all part of this process. We also want to vertically integrate the partners. I mentioned earlier that we can go horizontally and get all the locals, but do we need to bring in regional level, state level, and federal level partners who are going to be part of this process as well? We want to exercise and plan with all of these partners, and the IWT is a great place to do that. We get in there and we can actually exercise these activities. We can schedule, full-scale exercises. We can plan for these events. So it's a great way to conduct that process. We can identify best practices. We can identify new goals. And it allows us to work on long-term goals in the warning decision process. All right, so that's a little bit about IWTs, what they do, what they can do, what they have done. I've got tons of other examples from all kinds of IWTs around the country, but let me turn it over to you guys and see if you have any questions, comments, or examples you want to share.
Hi, Dr. Myers. This is Jeff again. I just wanted to touch base with you on two questions. Well, maybe other people formulate some additional questions for you. First of all, we are starting one here in Pennsylvania at the State College office, which covers about 20 counties. And we have a couple of different venues around. But what is your experience working with Commonwealth, being that the lowest form of government has the ultimate authority of jurisdiction?
Basically, with something like that, it becomes a more local process. It's interesting when you start talking about the forms of government and how government comes together, because like in every jurisdiction that I've worked in, it really depends a lot on that. You can imagine in Louisiana with the parish system, a Commonwealth system like what you're talking about, how is emergency management set up, how does government work in this process, and then you've got the Weather Service on top of that, which is federal, and so you've got all different kinds of dynamics in that process. So really it's a matter of figuring out, what kind of issues that's going to create for this process, and if you're trying to regionalize it and bring partners from different jurisdictions, what's that going to mean? Sometimes it's more difficult to get jurisdictions to work together because of what you're talking about. Other times it's a matter of really kind of, working through the whole communication process because they still want to. they want to work together, and they know that there needs to be mutual aid between, you know, these different entities and jurisdictions, and that they're going to have to work together, because unfortunately every disaster is local, but it becomes a catastrophe when it goes beyond the resources of that location. So they're going to end up needing each other in the process. So that's kind of the importance of that, and they know that. And sometimes your emergency managers are the ones that can kind of work through that, because they do that all the time. I have emergency managers who tell me all the time that they do a lot of this informally because of the governmental constraints and the problems associated with that. And your IWTs can actually enhance that process.
Okay, the second question I had, we're looking to start ours in June up in State College at Beaver Stadium, actually. The offices at Penn State there has been offered for the seminar. But the one question I have is, we have some large venues within that CWA, including Beaver Stadium, 2 amusement parks, Hershey and Knoebels, as well as some regional fairs. Now, I noticed you talked about having these organizations involved. Should that be from the get-go, or should we try to get things figured out and then maybe in the second round try to bring them in?
It really depends on what the relationship is like now. If they've been kind of, you know, really involved, if you've been doing decision support services for them and, you know, they've been involved in the process, it doesn't hurt to have them at the first one. If you think having them at the first one will make getting it started difficult, because a lot of times with the first one, you're really just trying to get the core partners all in the same place at the same time. And if you have those other partners there, it may be difficult to really kind of get it off the ground. So it really depends on that dynamic. I tell you, most places would say hold off. They would say wait until probably the next one. Okay,
great. We have a bunch of people on phone line. We can't tell how many, so if anyone has any questions that's on the phone, go ahead and unmute, and you can go ahead and talk. Okay, we'll give them a chance in case they don't. I had one question sent to me since we were having some of these issues with this Blackboard system. What role do you see these IWTs playing in the future? I guess how popular will they be, and what kind of roles will they actually play?
Well, just in the short time, which has been about 4 or 5 years that I've been working on them, I've seen them play a stronger role over time, and I think it's only going to get stronger, because there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of top-down work going on, and there's a lot of grassroots work going on in the warning dissemination process. And so I think, you know, when we're talking about trying to improve warning dissemination, we're trying to enhance the communication process, a lot of the IWTs are testing things, they're coming up with their own ideas, they're taking things from the top down and trying to implement them in their regions. And so it becomes a really good test bed for trying to improve the process, not just for the local IWT region, but for other regions of the country. So, for example, the impact-based messaging has been experimented with a lot of the local IWTs, and then there's been the national level work on IWTs, and they've started to kind of come together, and it's been a real interesting process to see how that's worked. And so there's a lot of other things that IWTs have worked on that I think are going to really trigger other regions to do it. And I see more IWTs every year. You'd be amazed at how many phone calls I get asking about how do you start one of these, and I've never seen an IWT die. They start, they grow, they continue, and so it just seems to be a really positive, progressive process.
Great. We'll open this up to any additional questions. I see we still have a teleconference on. I just want to make sure they have had a chance to figure out how to be able to talk if they want to.
And you've got my email address, so if any of you have any questions or want to make contact, please do that, and you know, be glad to answer any questions or provide any assistance to you for the development of an IWT.
I do have a question, if you don't mind. I know there's a study that's going on at one of our local Penn State campuses on the whole alert and warning, and if you said this, I missed it, I apologize. But do you know of that study? Have you been involved in that study where they're trying to figure out, you know, basically the same thing you're doing, how to properly warn people and get people, you know, how to send, I guess, from an emergency management standpoint, the right message so that people hear it and understand it.
I'm familiar with that study as well as several around the country. There's been a lot going on ever since the April 27th, 2011 tornadoes in the southeast. The Weather Service has been very interested in conducting those kind of studies in different parts of the country. And so we focused on it with severe weather, with hurricanes, with winter weather. So there's multiple studies that have been conducted and are currently being conducted to try to understand that process. And it's really getting at, how do people get their warnings? What modalities do they use? What works better? It focuses on lead time issues. It focuses on miscommunication and misunderstanding. So there's a lot of good stuff like that coming together. And the really good studies are the ones that are integrating the partners in the process. So, trying to find out from an emergency management perspective and a broadcast net perspective as well as the Weather Service perspective. Because when you're trying to disseminate the warnings, it's a matter of that whole group. So the studies that have focused on all of that, have really started to produce some consistent results. So there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we've reached our time, Dr. Myers. We really appreciate you coming to talk with us today and sitting through some of our technical glitches here. Hopefully, if people didn't get a chance to see this, they'll be able to watch the recording, which we'll put up shortly. Before we go, I just want to let everyone know that's listening, we have another virtual seminar series with Art Faulkner. He's the State EMA Director in Alabama. I know that I worked with Art and Laura when I lived in Montgomery and the Birmingham IWT, and he's going to talk about the EM side of that and working with National Weather Service and local meteorologists. So, Dr. Myers, thank you for working with us today, and we appreciate your talk here.
Sure, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks again. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.